everybody. I wanted to take a moment today to come speak with you about a few concepts I've been contemplating for a while now, but I thought might be interesting to share in what is hopefully a relatively shorter segment than my normal videos. I'm going to go for like maybe 10 or 15 minutes here instead of the usual 30 to 40 minutes. This idea emerged out of some of Jordan Peterson's work, actually. I've been interested in his work for a few years now. Before all of the controversy exploded around him, I was actually quite interested in what he was doing around, his work at the intersection of evolutionary psychology and mythology, as I was also digging kind of in that area and trying to understand the way that religion may represent some aspects of game theoretical reality and game theoretical premises within the evolutionary space, and how that relates to, or how we have encoded that linguistically. And so I was really interested in Jordan Peterson's work on maps of meaning, his lectures and the book. I had read all of that before this controversy. And so it's been an interesting ride seeing him, seeing the ascendancy of his work and, just him as a character, as a political persona, or I guess he would probably say as a non-political persona. But it's been a fascinating roller coaster to observe that and to some extent be a part of that. I had another video that I published that's also on this channel in which I interviewed him. I would recommend watching that if you haven't already checked that out and you do like Jordan Peterson's work, especially around the game theory and the iterated gameplay and the emergence of human morality type of stuff, as opposed to some of the more contemporary or politically oriented discussion. So why am I saying all this? I'm saying all of this because I attended one of his lectures here in San Francisco earlier this year. Not the 12 Rules book tour lecture, which I also attended, but the one I'm talking about right now was before this. It was for the simulation series. And it was a pretty cool lecture. It was a really interesting discussion, but while I was going to this, I had purchased a ticket that got access to a little bit of an extended event after the fact in which questions were to be asked. And I had spent a lot of time constructing or thinking about what I would ask, despite the fact that when I actually got to the event, as it turns out, only about 4 or 5 questions were picked at the end, and I didn't actually get to ask the question. That being said, it was still a very interesting exercise to contemplate what I would have asked, and the question that I was thinking about, that I wanted to ask, is the question or the idea that I'm going to talk about right now. So, what is this idea, or what is this question? The question has to do with Peterson's construction of how the idea, the symbolic or imagistic idea of God has emerged atop our conceptual meta-hierarchy. So as Peterson tells the story, the meta-story of God emerges from an accretion or an aggregation or an emergence of many small stories or many experiences that people have. Let's say we rewind the clock 100,000 years or 50,000 years, and you have individuals in many of these different small, relatively tribal groups and living arrangement who are experiencing all sorts of different environmentally significant activities or pieces of information. So some people are hunting, and some people are foraging, and some people are looking and trying to understand which pieces, which flowers or which berries are poisonous, and which animals are going to traverse near enough by the current location of the village to be able to be hunted, but not so close that it is dangerous, or that there are predatory threats to the town, or to the town is probably too formal of a word for what it was at that point. But you get the idea. There were these stories, people would bring back information and communicate it to the tribe, communicate it to the local group, and say, hey, I went out today looking for berries, but I saw a lion. It's a useful piece of information. That story then gets brought back into the culture or the cultural medium, and over time, all of these stories start aggregating and piling on each other, and a pattern emerges, and you start to distill these stories into different categories. So you'll have the stories about hunting, and the stories about farming, and the stories about gathering, and the stories about social interaction. And each of those stories will, all of those stories will begin to distill into the categories. And as that happens, the categories will take more personified form at the emergent layer. What is most important about those behavioral categories? What is most important about those specific aspects of human behavior within those experiential realms? The experiential realm of interpersonal relationships, the experiential realm of hunting, the experiential realm of farming. And so, as this story progresses, we then continuously represent these ideas more imagistically. So you would get a god of hunting, or a god of love, or a god of farming or agriculture, fertility, right? And the lines aren't exactly clear, but we continuously see these images abstracting and emerging and continually demonstrating more universal tendencies. And presumably at the top of this hierarchy, presumably at the top of this pyramid of emergent imagistic structure, as Peterson tells the story, is the archetype of God incarnate as a monotheistic, universalized representation that shows us or symbolizes to us what is perhaps the ultimate truth of these aggregated evolutionary pieces of information that we have communicated to one another in story. And we see this emergent structure, we see this emergent pyramid with ultimately the monotheistic structures emerging at the top as a unified consilience or consolidation, an evolutionary consilience of all of these different observed realities, these aspects of observed value in our experiential realm. So, as the story goes, there's this pyramid now that we're left with, and we have this idea, this imagistic representation of God. And so, my question, what I've been kind of contemplating is this process didn't just happen in one place. Obviously, this process happened in many places across the world, and in each of these places, we see slightly different variants of the emergence of this symbolic abstraction of what ends up at the top of the pyramid, whether it is the Godhead of Buddha, or whether it is Muhammad, or whether it is the Trinity, or one of various interpretations of that Christian God. There are different emergent structures throughout the world. And this is obvious to us. These are the world's different religions. These are the different perspectives on the absolute abstraction, the end result of the different emergent hierarchies of value around the world. And when the world was less connected, when the world did not necessarily observe itself as frequently or as voraciously as it does today, when it is now connected by digital media technologies and the internet, it may have been possible for all of those different superordinate or highest order images of our values to remain largely stable in isolation from one another. But over the past 100 years, we see that is increasingly less the case. Always historically, when these ultimate truths have come in conflict or come in contact with one another, there has been some need for reconciliation, whether that comes initially in the form of conflict and then some sort of reconciliation, or perhaps just straight to from a point of encountering a new culture to bringing their idea of God underneath the umbrella of your idea of God, which happened many times throughout the Middle East. If you look at the history of civilization's development and cultural development, we see when large, powerful empires came in contact with other smaller groups of people who had their own nascent or emerging structures, they would kind of either crush that structure and replace it with their own, or just say, oh, that God that you were discussing, that you might call it Horus, but we call it X, right? And it's like, it's the same thing. We'll just say that these were different words, and yet we're actually talking about the same thing, and everybody can remain peaceful. So taking a step back, this happens throughout the world. This happens in many different places, and it was disconnected, but now it's connected. And what are the implications for that connectivity? And it seems in my mind that what we are now faced with is a new meta-hierarchy, a new emergent hierarchy in which all of the elements, all of the members that were at the tops of their respective pyramids, their respective hierarchies, their respective spiritual paths of emergence, whether it is Buddha or Shiva or whether it is the Christian God or whether it is the Muslim God or whomever you might be talking about, they are now all returning to the bottom of a new pyramid. They are now all at the bottom, the base layer of a new emergent structure that we have yet to really grapple with. We're beginning to grapple with this structure, but it requires yet another cycle of synthesis, another cycle of emergence. So in the same way that we had these first order observations of hunting or fishing or gathering or interpersonal interactions, and we codified those into stories, and it took a very long period of time for us to abstract those aspects of our experiential reality into what became represented as gods. We are now doing the same thing again with the abstraction of gods as the base level of the pyramid. And my question, or the question that I was going to ask, which may have been difficult given how long it takes me to obviously give the context for this, but I had a more concise version of it. The question I was going to effectively ask was, what is at the top? In the same way that God, or the single unification of all of the values of society as represented by the image of a God, was at the top of these individual previous hierarchies of value. What is at the top, imagistically or symbolically, of this new emerging meta-hierarchy? And how, obviously it would be very difficult to just know what is at the top of that, but what might be the symbols or the types of signs that would lead us to at least an intimation of what it looks like to see that synthesis, that integration across all these different spiritual traditions, all these other hierarchies. And so I've been thinking quite a bit about that, and I don't necessarily have a specific answer just yet. I have a lot of ideas or intimations or just kind of loosely interrelated thoughts on the matter, but I did have an interesting moment of realization the other day when I was listening to Akira the Don's music. I think it was either the Alan Watts Dreams track or the new Jordan Peterson Genesis track that Akira has released, and both of which are really wonderful pieces of music. And I had a moment of reflection where I actually recognized in myself and in the moment of what was happening, standing in my living room making breakfast while listening to one of these pieces of music that is itself a compilation of a really meaningful speaker, whether it's Watts or Peterson or whomever else, set to music in order to synthesize these abstractions and these thoughts into something that might more readily be integrated with other modes of thought. So for example, there are certainly points of conflict between Alan Watts' philosophies and Jordan Peterson's philosophies. Or for example, Alan Watts' philosophies and Terence McKenna's. Or Akira has made videos about Joe Rogan, or he has made videos also about Jocko Willink, or he's used many different sources as the base material for this Meaningwave genre that he has created. Yet the Meaningwave genre is also an emergent structure that is itself the beginning of the synthesis process, or the synthesizing process that I was thinking about. And so I had a really interesting moment where it kind of snapped into my head that through music, through this new genre of music, this Meaningwave genre of music, we are beginning to see the musical integration of the meta-hierarchy of value across the space of multiple different types of human philosophy and spirituality. We are using music as a gateway. It is spilling forth through artists such as Akira in a manner that allows for the brain to synthesize this information and bypass the overly rationalized structures that might keep or might prevent those threads of thought from integrating in a purely logical or rational manner. And that tension of how the resistance to integration within the purely rational frame is something that can be seen quite readily in the debates between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. A little bit less so now that they've spoken with each other a few times now, but even in the most recent debates in Vancouver, both nights, you could very clearly see and feel deeply in your own being a tension there. And at times it feels like there's a back and forth that might be fundamentally irreducible within the confines of just language and debate and back and forth conversation. There might be an emotional sticking point or attachment to particular logical structures that just wouldn't allow, perhaps even if you played it out infinitely, would not allow for ultimate integration there. And I think that music, and in particular this modality of mixing and synthesizing music and meaning, of synthesizing the same information in a different context, a more musical context, and therefore perhaps allowing the mind to open itself to new types of combinations of this information might be the first step, or one of the first steps upon this integral or meta-emergent hierarchy of our values. And the imagistic structures that would emerge from that are also actually kind of represented in this space. I mean, the most clear example in my mind is if you watch the YouTube video for Akira's Alan Watts Dreams compilation, the image of Alan Watts is superimposed on, I'm not sure if it's Shiva or Vishnu, but one of these Hindu gods. And so you actually literally see a representation of a mashup of a spokesperson in the modern age who was the mouthpiece of the imagistic symbol of the Godhead that is now flowing into contemporary society through the platform of YouTube, both auditorily and imagistically, and therefore is able to be more readily synthesized, mixed, and integrated with other aspects of our philosophical and spiritual inquiry, or even rational inquiry. But I see it happening there in a way that I don't see it happening in the debate, on these many debate platforms, in these conversational contexts. Now, while I love conversation and I value conversation and debate above, maybe not above, but I value it immensely. And while I value it immensely, like any other tool, it has its limitations and boundaries. And I think this new Meaningwave genre is actually beginning to transcend those boundaries, or at least create a new space in which those boundaries might be less rigid, or might be more permeable to thought, might be more permeable to novel combinations. And as we know with genetics, as we know with mathematics, combinations can lead to very interesting explosions. And those interesting explosions will create a great deal of options from which we must choose, which will probably require an entirely new way of looking at and evaluating the value structures against which we compare these stories and imagistic representations. So the next step seems to be the types of outputs that will come from conversations between people like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, these more rationally, linguistically encoded structures that are themselves also a synthetic product of these meeting of different traditions. those will start to be used to reflect the more synthetic aspects of the musical integration or the imagistic symbols, and we will begin to evaluate which have value and which don't have value, and that'll be a selection process of this first order of emergence of this new meta hierarchy. And I'm not sure how long it will take for us to get to the top of this next hierarchy. Who knows? Things are accelerating. It might happen far more quickly than the 10 to 50,000 years it took for the initial imagistic representations to emerge of our symbolic gods. But it's unclear. It's impossible to predict the future, obviously. But it's interesting to think about, and I think we can see the patterns of synthesis, and I think we can perhaps suppose that this musical dimension is playing an invaluable role in our society's ability to synthesize or to download or to sense make in this new space. So yeah, I think that's probably a good place to stop, but this is just what I have been noodling on a little bit lately, and I would really love to hear your thoughts about this. So either send me a comment below, or if you want to support more conversations like this or have more private conversations, I have private conversations all the time with my Patreon supporters, so that's patreon.com/Matthew Perkowski. So I would really appreciate any help there, and trying to build a little bit of a community around that as well. But yeah, if you find this interesting, please give it a share, subscribe, like, and we'll talk to you soon. Take it easy, everybody.